All right, this is our lecture on Chapter 12, which is looking at kind of the interrelationships and individual changes that we see in weight status or body composition, overall fitness, and motor competence. Like I just mentioned, there are a lot of interrelationships that could happen between these three things. So we have to think of them as a working network instead of individual components of humans, right? And so typically we identify our definitions before proceeding with the conceptual development of stuff. And so body composition, as probably a review for most of you, but it's the composition of tissues making up the body. And this has a relationship with the amount of activity that someone might engage in. Typically, people who have an increased levels of activity are likely to have a more optimal body composition, right? Which usually we see optimal body composition as a lower body fat percentage and a higher lean muscle mass. Conversely, if people have less optimal body composition, so a higher fat mass, those people are usually going to tend to engage in lower levels of activity. So we can see how body composition affects activity levels, right? And that those activity levels could also be directly related to a person's motor competence. And motor competence is someone's foundational motor skill proficiency. So if you've taken 312, motor competence is more or less like motor abilities, or kind of what a person might be prone to being good at. So me, for example, I've told you guys before, I'm not a ball sport person, so I just don't have those motor abilities. But if you put me in areas of balance, flexibility, I'm actually a really good power athlete, I'm really fast, right? I have motor abilities in those different areas, so my motor competence for various motor behaviors that include those types of abilities is probably going to be higher than other skills and behaviors that include catching or throwing a ball, for example, right? But a person's motor competence, or how proficient they're likely to be in a skill, can influence how they engage with that certain type of skill. So thus, we have motor competence influencing how we also engage in physical activity. Okay, skilled movers usually are super energy efficient, right, through some type of sustained activity. So the level of experience can also influence motor competence, which can also influence physical activity. Okay, there's a lot of different moving parts here. But body composition can also be both a structural and functional constraint for motor competence. So a structural constraint, an example being that excess weight impedes movement. Right, we talked about in the previous lecture how if someone has a lot of adipose tissue, it might affect their range of motion, or it could create discomfort if they are engaging in an activity that requires like a lot of bouncing or movement, right? So in that way, body composition could be a structural constraint because it's restricting or limiting the amount of movement that can be done, which might deter some individuals from, or it might limit how good an individual could be versus if they didn't have that excess weight. Okay, but it also could be a functional constraint in terms of perceived motor competence, right? So we've talked about different individual functional constraints such as like motivation to do something, or if someone gets fatigued, or how much we're being stimulated, right, to perform a certain activity. So if someone has a low perception of how well they can actually do something, right, that directly is going to impact how much they engage with that activity. So a lot of kids, like my sister is a prime example of this. If she's not good at something, she just doesn't do it. So I remember when I started dancing, my mom was always the mother of equals. So whatever my sister had, I also had, and vice versa. Or whatever we were exposed to. So both of us, my sister wanted to play basketball. And so I played basketball for like 2 days and was like, this is not going to happen. And my sister I wanted to dance. So my mom was like, Vanessa, you should try dance too. Just to experience it, and then if you don't like it, we'll take you out of classes. So my sister also went into class. She actually really liked it because my sister loves music and both of us love to move in general. But as soon as the teachers, she was going through a tomboy phase at the time, and the teachers were like, oh, your costume's going to be a dress. And my sister was like, I want to wear pants. And that was not an option for our group. So she dropped out, right? But that's more of, I guess, an environmental factor in that particular example. But in addition to having to wear a dress, she also didn't pick up choreography very quickly, whereas I did. So in that case, I had a higher motor competence for picking up certain types of dance movements than my sister did. And because she wasn't as good as I was, it deterred her, right? Her perception of her competence deterred her from actually continuing participation in dance, as well as the fact that she didn't want to wear a dress. So in terms of, like, we could also use an example of overweight individuals, right? If they don't think that they can do something because of their weight, they are less likely to engage in that activity. So you can see how body composition, physical activity, and motor competence are kind of woven into this network, right? And if we have an ideal or optimal body composition, where we've got this kind of concept of this lower fat mass, higher lean mass, we become more efficient movers, right? And it's easier to engage in activity and therefore practice activities so that we can gain more competence and skills that maybe we might have a lower foundational skill proficiency in. But the main thing is to look at this web and to see that everything is interconnected, right? So we talked about the three things we just talked about were this triangle of motor competence with body composition and physical activity, but also having that functional constraint of perceived motor competence, and then overall health-related fitness, right? If we're not engaging in certain activities, we're going to have an overall lower fitness level. So that takes us into our first topic of body composition. So when we talk about body composition, we talk about various tissues and the weight of various tissues or the percentage of various tissues that make up the body as a whole. So when we look at body mass, which we've commented on in previous lectures, that is usually broken down into fat-free mass and fat mass, or we can also call this lean tissue and adipose tissue, or muscle tissue and fat tissue, right? Any way you look at it. But lean or fat-free mass is usually going to be including muscle, bones, organs, anything that's not fat basically, water, which makes up actually a lot of our body weight, is water. Especially if you have more muscle, you have more water because muscles require a lot of water, or they hold a lot of water at least. And then our fat mass is purely adipose tissue, right? So we've got this little schematic on the side that kind of breaks down how our body mass is divided. When we talk about body composition, we're looking at percentages of our fat-free mass and our percent of our fat mass. Okay, so that's how we're kind of splitting the two, right? They have different units of measurement. But when we talk about body composition, usually this is centralized around the conversation on obesity, right? And how obesity is going to influence our health. So we try to optimize or have an ideal body composition. So any of you who have done exercise physiology and have looked at your BMI, right? There's a scale that we go off of that says this is normal, a normal BMI, or your height compared to your weight, right? This is a normal BMI. If you're overweight, you have a certain value and above, and if you're obese, I think overweight is like 25, obese is 30, right? But we also have not just optimizing so that we're having as low fat mass as possible with as much lean mass, but it's optimal, right? Because we can go the reverse direction, and on the BMI scale, you have underweight individuals, which usually can point to various eating disorders or nutritional deficits, or it could even be something genetically related, perhaps, if someone doesn't metabolize certain types of nutrients, or if your body doesn't naturally absorb certain minerals that it should. So my mom is actually a good example of that. She, I think, went in to get blood work done one time, and she wasn't absorbing iron or calcium, which are two huge things. And the doctor actually told her, based off her lab work, he was like, I'm kind of surprised that you're not hospitalized right now, because based on your levels, you should not even be able to walk around on a daily basis. And so that caused her to have to take some different supplements and medications that were going to help her absorption of those nutrients that she was lacking. But those, we know that various, like calcium, for example, has a direct effect on our fat-free mass in terms of bone density, right? So it's not always the obesity thing that we're pushing, right? It's usually the one that gets talked about the most, because that is kind of a global issue that is affecting all-cause mortality, right? Or leads to certain diseases like heart disease, right? Obesity is linked with heart disease, and there are certain risk factors that are associated with kind of getting different types of diseases and cancers, and obesity or being overweight can have a lot more negative effects than if you're at an ideal weight or if you're underweight, although the other end of the spectrum is still important to talk about, right? But in terms of obesity, it has a negative link to work capacity, increased workload on the body, right? If you're carrying more weight, it takes a lot more energy to move that weight around. Decreased range of motion, which we talked about in our lecture on flexibility. And we also have increased risk of a range of health issues, which I just mentioned. Okay, so usually kind of the upper end of the BMI spectrum is what is emphasized. But we still need some amount of fat mass, right? So that's why there is an optimal range in terms of what your body fat percentage should be. And that's because fat has a lot of really important functions for our body, right? It's an insulation or thermal regulator, so that we can help to, regulate our heat production. It also serves as a form of protection. So we talked about this in our body systems lecture, right? If you have various joint structures such as fat pads that act to cushion your bone, right? So we still need some degree of fat. It's also good for energy storage. So we know we have fat-soluble vitamins like our DAIC vitamins that are stored in fat. Fat is also a source of energy, right, for more of our endurance-related or oxidative processes. So we don't want to get rid of fat completely. It is important, and it has a lot of very critical roles to normal body function. So too much of it is not great, but also too little could also, raise concerns for health as well. Women in particular, the book specifies, need about 12% body fat to support reproductive function. So usually when we get on the topic of like eating disorders and individuals have an extremely low BMI or extremely low percentage of body fat, they stop menstruating, right? And I think they call that amenorrhea, right? And that's one of, there's a triad, the female, it's a triad. I remember it's a triad. I don't remember what the actual name of it, but it's female something triad. And amenorrhea is one of the factors that is usually an identifier for an eating disorder. Anyways, specifically if there is a lack of eating, such as like an anorexia. But women need about 12% body fat to support their reproductive function and to have normal hormonal regulation, specifically for the gonadal hormones. But we also have the basal metabolic rate, which kind of dictates how much energy we need to keep the body functioning. So the maintenance of our body composition is going to help balance the amount of energy consumed and the amount of physical exertion we put out, right? So how much food we take in should be balanced roughly with how much energy we are expending on a daily basis. And we can control, right, this body composition typically through diet and exercise. we can't necessarily change our basal metabolic rate short term, but because I don't remember the exact ways that your BMR fluctuates throughout the lifespan, but it does fluctuate. It does change. It could change based on how, or like what your dietary intake is. Because my mom has done a lot of reading. She has been on a ketogenic diet for, I want to say almost 2 years now. She's lost like over 200 pounds, which is crazy. She's in a maintenance phase now, so she's not strict keto anymore, but she had done a lot of reading on how a keto diet can, and fluctuating how you implement keto in your daily life can influence your basal metabolic rate. It's not going to change drastically, but it does change slightly short term. Okay. But again, body composition, most affected by diet and exercise. So now let's look at the lifespan. If we look at body composition and exercise in youth, there was a study that the book presented by Perizkova, probably said that wrong, but it was done in the 70s. And again, if these figures are difficult to view, you can always either look in the textbook if you have it, or they are available on the PowerPoint and you can just increase the size there if you need it. But they took 100 boys between the ages of 10 and 14 and studied them over a 4-year period. So this is a longitudinal design. And they divided the individuals based on their activity levels. So they had a most active group and a least active group. And what the study showed over this 4-year period is that physical activity increased lean body mass and minimized addition of fat mass. So if we look at the left graph, that is looking at their body fat percentage, and we can see the least active group maintains a higher body fat percentage, and it doesn't really, change drastically from that higher point. Also, this is an adolescent period for boys, so we know that body fat decreases for males during their adolescent stages. However, I think the main takeaway here is that staying more active can not only lead to a decrease in their body fat percentage, right? Which, I mean, we can't say that activity is directly affecting the decrease in body fat because we also have those maturational changes that are taking place, but being more active definitely helps in terms of not having a lot of addition of extra fat mass, or kind of staying more in a maintenance phase of body fat percentage. The same thing goes for lean body fat, or, lean body mass. Just want to talk about fat. But physical activity is going to help increase, right? And we know that adolescent boys are automatically going to have increases in their muscular system, or their muscle size because of testosterone. But you can see that the most active group does maintain a higher lean body mass than the non-active group in purple. Okay. So those are 2 takeaways from that study. They also did a study on females, same researchers, different time, and they looked at 32 gymnasts compared to 45 sedentary females between the ages of 12 and 13 for 5 years. Okay, so again, they followed the same individuals over time, and what they noticed is that there was an increase in total body mass, but fat mass was relatively maintained. So the increase in total body mass makes sense, right? Because again, we're in an adolescent period, and there's height and weight are presented on these 2 top graphs, and we can see that both of those are increasing, which we would expect, right? So total mass is going to change because overall size or physical size is changing. But what they found interesting is that the fat mass was maintained, and that periods of rest were associated with thicker fold or skin fold measurements. So in this study, they used skin fold measurements as their body composition measurement or test method. And so this bottom graph is showing the total skin fold thickness, which we can directly relate to their fat mass, right? And so we can see that throughout this time, despite the fact that total body mass is increasing, we generally see this relatively plateaued level, right, of skin fold thickness, and they had these periods down here in these like blue shaded boxes that showed what their intensity of their training was. And we can see in the gaps here, right, in these little spaces, there are increases in skin fold thickness. So I think what that shows is that the more in periods of activity, you kind of minimize how much fat mass is gained. In most cases, when their intensity increased, their fat mass decreased. But when they took time off from that activity, their fat mass went back up as a measurement of their skin fold thickness. So kind of a direct relation between how physical activity impacts body composition. But additional research showed that persistent patterns of activity versus sedentary behaviors throughout childhood and adolescence also showed, or there are persistent patterns in terms of activity. So more activity is better than none for your body composition as a whole in childhood and adolescent ages. In terms of adulthood, exercise can either influence an increase in fat-free mass. So we talked about strength gains, right? The more physically active you are, the more fat-free mass that you can gain, right? And the more stress you place on your bones, the denser they become because you kind of stimulate those bone-building processes. But it can also influence body composition by decreasing fat mass, right? So if you're burning more fat or you're expending more energy and you're utilizing more fat, you could decrease your potential or your total fat mass as a result of engaging in activity. There are 3 studies that I wanted to pull out from the textbook. Binder et al. Showed that older adults who engage in activity in a low-intensity exercise program increased their fat-free mass but had no change in fat mass. Okay, so they increased their muscle mass and their bone mass. So low intensity might be good maybe for people who have osteoporosis, maybe, right? But they didn't have a change in fat mass. Gomez and Cabello showed that strength training improves or maintains bone mass in older adults. So again, contributions to increases in fat-free mass. And then Schwartz showed that endurance training programs, gradually working up to about 85% of your heart rate reserve, showed results in decreased fat mass, but no changes in fat-free mass. Okay, so higher intensity exercise seems to benefit decreases in fat mass, whereas lower intensity exercise or strength training or strength-specific exercises will have more of a benefit on fat-free mass. Okay, so again, how you train is specific to the outcomes that you see.